Well, good morning. It's time to get started with our class this morning. Always good to hear everybody getting a chance to get caught up and fellowship together. There are, if you're really good at what I said last week, paying attention and hanging on my every word. I know that's not true, but even if you're hanging on some of the words, you'll remember that I said that the series that we were doing of looking at Old Testament cities, I'd kind of run out of the ones with the exception of Jerusalem that I could do. My shoulder's still a little sore from the arm twisting I received. Go ahead and do Jerusalem. So I thought, okay, we'll do one more. I jokingly said that. I did have a couple people come up and say, I was really hoping we'd still do Jerusalem. Okay, we'll do Jerusalem. But here's the deal. Jerusalem could take a quarter to get through, and we're just going to hit a few highlights of some of the things. So again, if you're visiting this morning, we've been looking at, rather than looking at a particular story and studying it, the city of Jerusalem still has one particular wall, what's often called the Wailing Wall or the West Wall, that is still a part of the temple wall after the destruction. We know eventually the city was just annihilated in the way its destruction happened in AD 70. And never got back to what it was prior to that in the sense of how it was all kind of there. But it was called the City of David. That was obviously essentially the founder of it. Prior to that, there was a city, but it was not under any Israelite control of much. So one source claims that in the long history of Jerusalem, if you were to add up everything that had happened there, Jerusalem was destroyed twice, besieged 23 times, captured and recaptured 44 times, and attacked 52 times. That's a lot going on in one town. That's a lot of perseverance to keep building it and rebuilding it as well. Now, prior to David coming on, he captured the city, but it was first run by the Jebusites. And so they had it before, and it was in the kind of the clan of the Amorites. And so it was an Amorite city. It was inhabited not only even after the conquest, it was still inhabited by the Jebusites until David comes and conquers Jerusalem. So I picked out a few stories that are big stories, big events that took place in here. One of them is in Joshua 10, and this should be a familiar one. You know the story of the sun standing still and how much of that actually has to do with what happened in the city of Jerusalem. So Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it. Remember, this is in the early days of the conquest. The very first city goes down is Jericho, and then right after that, because of Achan's sin, they lose it, Ai, and then they finally kill Achan and his whole family and get rid of the plunder that was stolen from Jericho, and then they're able to completely rout Ai. And so once that happens, then some of these kings, because each city had its own king, Jerusalem had a king, Adonizedek. And so he starts to, he gets word that Ai had fallen. And so what he did there, knowing what happened to that and the king and all that had happened at Jericho as well and its king, and that the people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace with Israel and had become their allies, they're kind of seeing this domino effect falling. Well, Jericho went down and Ai went down and Gibeon just gave up. And so you see all of these things that are there. So he and his people were very much alarmed at this because Gibeon was an important city, like one of the royal cities. It was larger than Ai, and its men were good fighters. And so they're starting to get a little nervous of there's something going on in the middle of what now we know is the conquest, but of these Israelites who are marching their way through. The Gibeonites sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all of the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us. So Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army, including all the best fighting men. The Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you. So God gives us promise that, again, you kind of see this idea that he is going to now give this area over to them. Now, this is important because this is how we start to get Jerusalem into the hands of his people. And I think you can see why God spends so much time making sure that this battle, there's no doubt in God's mind, this battle is going to be won by the Israelites because he's going to have Jerusalem. And there's so much of what's going to take place down the road there. So after an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise. The Lord threw them into confusion before Israel, so Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely at Gibeon. Israel pursued them along the road, going up to Beth Horon, and cut down all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled before Israel on the rode down from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them. And more of them died from the hail than were killed by the sword of the Israelites. Just to put it in some perspective, this is not getting explained by some severe thunderstorm popped up there. And getting into my wheelhouse here on this one, I can tell you, we haven't had a person in the United States die from a hailstone since the year 2000 in Fort Worth. I mean, that's been a long time since we've had a hail death. We get some really big hail, more than anywhere else naturally on Earth in the central and southern plains of the United States, particularly the central plains. We don't have to worry about that this is some natural occurrence that, all of a sudden you're going to have more people dying from a hailstorm than anything else. Yeah, hail can be deadly, but the way it forms and the way it comes, it doesn't randomly come with the big stones first. And so you can always find a way to get to shelter. This is something different. There's no discussion about it pouring rain. There's no discussion about anything else. Large hailstones just get pelted down at them. This was God defeating them. This is most certainly God intervening on this particular one. We see him intervene even more through this. On the day that the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Aijalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies. As it is written in the book of Jashar, the sun stopped in the middle of the day and delayed going down about a full day. There's never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. And he was, because he wants Jerusalem. Now it's interesting, this one becomes another one that you would really have a really hard time explaining naturally. If he stopped the spin of the earth, we're moving at our latitude 750 miles per hour to the east. If all of a sudden we came still, our air would rush at us at a 750 mile per hour wind, and essentially everything would be destroyed. So either he stopped the earth spinning and held everything in place and overcame all momentum, which in and of itself is miraculous, or he completely changed the laws of light travel in such a way that he allowed the sunlight to stay fixed where it was. Still, it's a miraculous thing. No matter how you look at it, this event shows God's power even over nature as well. But he had a purpose behind it. He had a purpose, and that was getting Jerusalem. All right, now we're up to Judges chapter 1. When Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they struck down 10,000 men at Bezek. It was there that they found Adonai-Bezek. Remember the name? King of Jerusalem, right? So they found him and fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adonai-Bezek fled, and they chased him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Then Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. The men of Judah attacked Jerusalem also and took it. They put the city to the sword and set it on fire. One of the destructions that we see of Jerusalem, they're getting rid of the Amorite king, or as the Jebusites end up kind of settling in there, but this Amorite king, Adonai-Bezek, who apparently went around when he would attack people, he would capture them and enslave them into his palace by cutting off their fingers or their thumbs and their big toes. And so what a perfect way for him to have to go. It's like, you like to do that? We'll do that to you. And he dies in Jerusalem over that. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, we finally see that now David has taken over Jerusalem, and it has been now brought into Israelite control. But one of the things that has not yet happened is the true ability to worship God there with the Ark of the Covenant in place. And so I've asked for Josh to read for us verse 17 out of 2 Samuel 6. All right, thank you. So there you see that now the ark has made its way in, and it's made its way there, and David's sacrificing burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. And verse 18 says, after he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people. and the name of the Lord Almighty. And then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. You look at the story that's leading up to this. This is the same story where he had gone down to the ark had been stolen, and it was in the hand of the Philistines, and they finally were like, take it back. Here's some gold tumors and gold rats for your trouble. Get it away from us. This is the tail end of this story. And so they wanted it to go back. So it's been down in the southern part of Israel for a while. He goes to get it, David, but doesn't seek what's the proper way of doing it. And so they're taking it by cart, not supposed to be doing that. And so when it starts to tip over, Uzzah's like, I'll catch it. As though touching the ark was an option, he grabs it, touches it, drops dead. David's like, there's a little scary thing here. So he puts it into a guy's house. And so, sorry, skipped ahead. Didn't mean to push that yet. So he puts it into Obed-Edom's house. And so Obed-Edom's just got it in his living room, which is just when you really think about it, I don't know if it's living room or his dining room or where he had it. They probably a one-room house anyway. It's there in his house. And so finally, after he becomes blessed with it there for 3 months, David's like, let's bring it back up to Jerusalem. The ark makes it up to Jerusalem, and that was kind of his celebration of it there at the end in 2 Samuel chapter 6. So now the ark has made it to Jerusalem. So now you have this, but David is not the one who needs to be the one building the temple to God. God was clear about that. You're a man who's been known for shedding blood. You're not going to be the one building my temple. Your son will do it. And so then the children of David start to have some issues, one of which, Absalom, had killed one of his brothers, fled, and was kind of living away for quite a while. He returns to Jerusalem because finally David wanted him back. He'd already lost one child, and now he's got another one that he wants to return. But Absalom lives there for 2 years, never saw David. They're like near each other, but never quite there. And David doesn't really want to face him quite yet. So there, he spent time winning people over at the city gates and essentially planning a coup attempt over David. He would sit there, and as they came into the city, be like, it's too bad no one will listen to you. I'd listen to you. You've got a great story to tell. I totally believe everything you've got to say. And he just said all of what they wanted to hear. And then he'd turn them away, and they never got a chance to even see David. But they left thinking, man, I wish Absalom was king. I wish Absalom was king. And just insidious, the way he went around and he planted these seeds of that. And so he carries out this plan to become king. David ends up having to flee. Long story short, and it is a rather long story, about 6-7 chapters worth. Absalom dies, and David becomes back onto kind of the established king. There was a period of time where, not to say he wasn't king, but there was a little bit of a split there, and there was followers of Absalom and some of David's followers. But the tide was certainly swinging toward Absalom until he was killed. So now we've got David back into control there, and after David is there and there we see Solomon then take over after David's reign is over. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, this is in 1 Kings 3, with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So there we see kind of when this takes place. Now we see Jerusalem being built up into what we're going to see being the location that we're more familiar with through a lot of the Old Testament stories. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built in the name of the Lord. I wish we could say that as soon as the temple was built, it fixed all this whole going and worshiping at high places and worshiping other gods, but we've seen what really happens. We know that this was a constant battle of fighting, of trying to get the Israelites to not go worship other places and worship other gods whenever they had the opportunity to. They'd find somebody nearby. Oh, you've got a god? Let's go worship him. I mean, that's pretty much what it seems like. When you look at it, so many times there was this very flippant following from the Israelites. So the people were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burnt incense on the high places. But eventually he builds this temple, and he's going to work to refocus the worship into that. This is really difficult time because without a temple, you don't have the practice of the priests in that same kind of setting that we'll see later. So for the people in the days of David and the days of Solomon, living in these small remote villages, not in Jerusalem, where you might actually start to see the worship of God happening, it explains, doesn't excuse, but explains why there was so much of a tendency to worship what was closer to them. And, it wasn't that it was inconvenient. It wasn't an option sometimes to go do any kind of worship in Jerusalem most of the year. It's not like they could just, get in their car and head down the road to Jerusalem. I mean, it was incapable of being able to get to Jerusalem, either financially or physically. And so for them to not even have that, which was just now being built, you can see why so much idol worship was an issue. But we start to see Jerusalem become such a hub, and there's a lot more ease of getting to Jerusalem over the next several generations because there was so much travel in and out of Jerusalem. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant." I should point out too, and I said this, the sacrifice at the high place that Solomon did was not listed as idol worship, okay? So we should make sure that part was clear. I don't know if that came out clearly when I said it. There was a lot of idol worshiping going on and all over, and worship in random places, some of which was worshiping God, not all of it. This particular one was. And so you see, he was actually sacrificing to God, just not at the temple because it wasn't built yet. All right, so Solomon said on this one, he answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You've continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne to this very day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king, place of my father David. But I'm only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administering justice, I will do what I've asked, and I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you've not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in confidence to me and keep my decrees and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life." Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all his court. And I think in that moment, when he had that opportunity and that dream to have God speak to him, worship becomes refocused at that point, not only from Solomon, but I think going forward, we're going to see Israel as a whole. That's a refocusing point where Jerusalem becomes a much more centralized location to worship God during that time. Also the same location, though, that just a few chapters later, the kingdom's going to divide there as well, because Solomon's sons have a whole different issue. So Jeroboam and Rehoboam, they didn't like each other. I think that's probably a quick summary of the chapters leading up to that. King Rehoboam sent out to Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. When the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. And so now you see Rehoboam back into back into Jerusalem, and Israel becomes that. And then you've got Judah, who's going to be staying loyal to the house of David. And so now you've got the kingdom dividing, and that kingdom divides there. When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered all Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 able young men, to go to war against Israel and regain the kingdom for Rehoboam, son of Solomon. And so again, Judah is there. So now he's trying to build up this fight. He's ready, 180,000 men. He's going to go and he's going to fight against his own people. And he's going to win this back over to tie back in this kingdom together. But this is the word of the Lord came to Shemaiah, the man of God. Say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says. Do not go up and fight against your brothers, the Israelites. So you have the Israelites who have completely disbanded. I think I may have said that backward the last time, now that it comes out this time. But the Israelites completely separate away from the house of David. Judah is still following the house of David. And so he gets ready to bring them up to this war. But the Lord says, do not go up and do that. I don't want Judah at war with Israel, basically, is what he didn't want to have happen. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again as the Lord had ordered. And from that point on, we see Jerusalem only in the sense of the divided kingdom for a long period of time. I want to get to some New Testament stuff, so I'm just going to gloss over a couple of these other big Old Testament events that happened there. The temple was restored a little bit later during the time of the divided kingdom. One of the kings, after a long period of time where evil king, did evil in the eyes of the Lord, Josiah comes along. He actually finds the book of the law in Jerusalem, in the temple, dusts it off. Well, he wasn't the one that found it, but the high priest did and brings it to him. And they end up having a Passover feast that hadn't been celebrated there in so long, because they finally knew what they were supposed to be doing again. But a lot of rebellious acts leads to Jerusalem being conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. And that was largely over making deals with trying to work with Egypt instead of working with them. Jehoiakim gets taken out, and his uncle Jehoiachin, maybe having those backward. I never which one's the nephew and which one's the uncle. But one of the kin or chin, one of them gets put into place basically just to kind of run things for a while. And eventually Nebuchadnezzar comes in and ransacks the place and takes them. The temple was burned and the walls were torn down during that time. They take some of the articles from the temple, which becomes a big part of the writing on the wall story when Belshazzar comes out and tries to use those things as a snubbing of his own attitude toward God, and he dies that night. But a little bit later on, after Daniel comes on the scene and gains favor with a lot of the leaders and rises to power, Cyrus of Persia allows a group to go back and rebuild the city and rebuild the temple, the city walls and everything. And we see that happen in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So we get back into worship again at Jerusalem after that time. And that was not an easy process. It took generations. There was a lot of resistance. But then we get to the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. After miracles had been happening around there, after Jesus had been on the scene there, already in and out of Jerusalem, preaching, teaching, having miracles, we see that the disciples went out and did as Jesus had instructed them. He said, go into the city. You'll find a colt of a donkey, never ridden before. And so they do that. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, who is this? The crowds answered, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. And oh, that week changes. It goes from such a wonderful entry into the city where Jesus comes to the city that God had started from the very early days trying to bring back in his people to that. But he finally gets them to a point where now Jesus comes in and how quickly they're going to turn on him. And the crowds are going to eventually shout back to crucify him. A little bit later in Matthew 24, Jesus left the temple and was walking away with his disciples when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things, he asked? Remember, these were rebuilt during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah. And he's pointing to all these buildings that have been rebuilt through a long period of time, trying to get worship back into Jerusalem. And the Pharisees had built up this entire, system of running this whole city there. Do you see all these things, he asked? Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. And you see the ruins today of what it looks like. Because we know what happens in AD 70 when the people come and there's this, one of the most horrific sieges of a city and capturing of a city that we see in history. And then we see him taking the Lord's the Last Supper. The Lord gathers his disciples. On the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparation for you to eat the Passover?" He replied, "Go to the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house." So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. And then as he goes on, those last days, Jesus was arrested in Jerusalem, brought before the Sanhedrin. He was slapped, beaten, spat on, and called a blasphemer in Jerusalem. He was tried before Pilate in Jerusalem. He was sentenced to death there in Jerusalem as well. He was forced to go through Jerusalem carrying his own cross outside of town to Calvary. And he died the cruel death on that cross just outside in probably the view of Jerusalem there around him, and so many people from that city who had gone out there to watch it happen. Eventually, he returns risen. And that is so important to the city that rejected him. He'll go in as well and see this. I'd say this may be, in my opinion, of all the ones that we've looked at, maybe the biggest event that takes place. And it's during the moment of his death. The resurrection would be hard to say is not the biggest event. But this one is a hugely important event. When Jesus cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That's the event. Why is that such a huge event? Because that curtain represented you can't come too close to God. You can't come too close to me. In Jerusalem, there was a constant reminder, this is God's dwelling place, but you have to keep your distance. You're not allowed to be right up next to him. And then Jesus comes, gives his life, and when he dies on that cross, even before he's resurrected, at the moment that he gives up his life for us, that curtain is torn and says, you now have a way in. And it was God tearing it from top to bottom. And I can only imagine those priests who were still in the temple looking up at that wall of a thick curtain. There was no tearing that thing by human hands, to look at it and just watch it rip right before their eyes. At the same time, it had been dark. There had been the earthquake. There had been all these other things that happened. The earth shook. The rocks split. The tombs broke open, let alone, I always joke around calling it the zombies start coming out. The bodies of the holy people who died were raised alive. They came to the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. And there were some people who witnessed that curtain being torn and then everything else that happened after. And it's no surprise then on the day of Pentecost, which also happened to happen in Jerusalem, that the church began there and it grows out from there. So again, it's one of those locations that, how do you pick just a handful of things? But I hope those are some big key things. For those who were in first service, I kind of said we would kind of talk a little bit more, even in the class period, about what so many people focus their attention on for today as Easter, and that idea of his resurrection. The events that entirely surround it are so critical to our understanding of what it means to us and what we can take from that. This idea that in this city of Jerusalem, which is no longer the city of this hub of religious focus like it once was in some respects, but we're told that what happens when he returns again is he brings us up as a new Jerusalem. And we're raised up into this, this heavenly Jerusalem. And he keeps using that as a reference point to us. And so it's really important to understand how it kind of fits in. And quite honestly, 30 minutes could never do it justice. There are so many amazing stories that took place in there. But maybe just seeing a few of those highlights helps us to remember why God's events and his plan can be woven through even at locations. And by that, hopefully we can kind of see that God's plan is way bigger than each individual event. It's bigger than us. But when you look at the most important part of his plan, all of it was leading up to the cross, and the cross changes everything on the other side of it. If we get nothing else out of that study of Jerusalem, that's good enough. That's good. That's good stuff to get out of that. So, anybody have any final comments? I know we're kind of out of time, but yeah.
Thank you, man.
Thank you. So we're going to move on. Actually, you'd kind of recommend it. I think I'm going with one of your suggestions. I think next we're going to move on to Daniel. I like teaching from that, so that's where we'll start up next week. We are actually this time, I've said it now, so now I have to commit to it. We are going to be done with doing the cities study. So we're going to move on to the study of Daniel. And I think we're going to get a lot out of that as well, because that's an amazing set of stories of God's taking care of his people through some tough love, which we talked about in the first time. And for those who are here for the second service, we'll be looking at that this morning as well. So we'll dismiss you from class. If you are sticking around, be sure to find your way into a green marked pew for the second service. And if you're leaving for the day because you've already been here, have a great rest of your Sunday, and look forward to seeing you next week.